Hello, everybody. My name is Michel Agier, and I am the Scientific Director of the Policy Department at CI Migration. I am pleased to moderate this first session on sanctuary cities and welcoming territories. I will allow me some words using the title of my last book in English, The Stranger as My Guest, A Critical Anthropology of Hospitality, to introduce this first session of debate. The so-called refugee crisis in Europe in 2015 provoked a peculiar form of mobilization and politicization, opening doors of domestic lives and places to receive strangers, claiming even that it was unconditional, like Jacques Derrida claimed himself 20 years before. My point, Derridean but realistic or ethnographic, has been to question the conditions of unconditionality. Among these conditions, the main one is that when we think we act by way of a very personal impulse, moral or political, actually we always perform the welcoming through some kind of community, collective networks, associations, Facebook groups, religious or political assemblies or committees, sometimes institutional backgrounds. During this very critical period since 2015, we could observe the development of these collective frameworks that turned possible even in context or territories of national hostility, different ways of making the strangers our guests. They emerged from villages, cities, national and transnational networks. These different scales of welcoming strategies, from local to global, let's say, will be discussed now by our keynote speaker, Mireille Paquet, and our three researchers and fellows of CI Migration, successively Bénédicte Michalon, Cyril Hanap, and Thomas Lacroix. This session will perhaps allow us, I hope, to reconsider another question put by Derrida about the public act of foundation of an ephemeral network of refuge cities in 1995. He said, "What can we ask to the cities?" Or I add, to the villages, civil societies, and transnational networks that we nearly renounce to ask to the state. Now I want to thank Mireille Paquet to be with us as keynote speaker. Mireille Paquet is a political scientist and associate professor at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. She researches immigration politics and policy in Canada and other countries. She managed the Canadian Sanctuary Cities Research Project, funded by the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities, BMRC. Mireille Paquet recently published the article Subnational Migration States and the New Politics of Immigration in the journal International Migration, 2020. She will introduce the session with her thoughts on sanctuary cities. Mireille, please.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is an honor to be speaking with you today. I would have loved to be in France. That was the original plan a long, long time ago. But nonetheless, I feel lucky to still be able to exchange with you from my office in Montreal. So today I want to report on an ongoing project on sanctuary cities in Canada, which is a form of local intervention to support immigrant without status or immigrant living with precarious status, and is also a general local response to global exclusionary trends. My intervention today does not mean to argue for or against these policies, even if I am deeply in favor of them and believe that we can extend a lot through the local scale. Instead, what I want to do today is use a policy design approach as well as the results of a national survey we are conducting to show that behind the encouraging label and the global enthusiasm towards the city as a space of inclusion or the language of sanctuary through cities, the reality of how these policies unfold and their impact remain fraught and ambivalent, and that it is important to think about that. Ultimately, I propose that even in cases of policies that some could label as act of radical solidarity or inclusion, immigration studies, political science, and other social science must also pay attention to issues of clientelism, the logic behind policy adoption, as well as the way in which cities use inclusionary seeming policies as part of their toolkit to market themselves in a neoliberal era. So I hope that will open the discussion for us this afternoon. So what do we mean when we talk about sanctuary cities? Sanctuary cities, it means different things for different people. It means different things in different contexts, and it also means different things in lay understanding. But in North America, and this is different than in other parts of the world, we can talk about this during a question period, it usually refers to policies that aim at supporting residents without legal status or who are living in the city with precarious migration status through multiple means, such as providing services without asking for immigration status, providing alternative forms of identification, resisting immigration enforcement at the local level, as well as implementing police policies without asking about immigration status. It is important to note that these policies are not regularization policies. They aim at allow people to live in the city without being controlled for their immigration status. And why do people advocate for these policies, and why do even elected officials want to go in that direction? So there are really three things that are usually discussed. One of them is obviously, like Michelle was just talking about, all our more normative arguments about the right to the city and social justice and the reality of global exclusion. But there are also more functional justifications, such as the idea that if you have a large undocumented population in a city, it is impossible to actually deliver your services as a city with a large population that does not want to engage with the state. So the idea is effectiveness. And there's also a broad group of literature that shows that these policies generally aim or allow to decrease crime because people without immigration status are actually in a position to go to the police and to engage with the police without fear of being deported or detained. Though in practice, it's much more complicated than that. And the literature on sanctuary policy adoption, so explaining why some cities decide to adopt such policy, has been mostly focused on the US case because they have more sanctuary cities. They also have generally more cities than Canada. And there are usually three drivers that are being identified in this literature. So some people just basically show that if you have a large population of undocumented, non-status, or precarious residents, you have some chances or bigger chances of implementing such a policy. If there is a disconnect between the ideological leaning of local mayors or even state leaders and the national governments, or a conflict between those levels, there's also a chance a bigger chance that you will implement such policies. And if you have a strong social movement demanding such policy, there is obviously more chance that such policy would be adopted. Now we turn to our project. So, we were interested in why is it that in Canada, some cities decided to implement sanctuary policies. So as you can see in the table below on the slide, since 2013, 7 Canadian cities have implemented or declared such, sanctuary policies. And what's important for us, and I think for you to understand, is that these include like the 3 biggest Canadian cities. And as you can see, Canadian cities are not super populous, and they don't also have large immigrant populations themselves. So for us, that was interesting, right? Because we saw, well, Canada doesn't have a large undocumented population. Cities of all sizes actually implement such policies, and we don't really have large national and local conflict over immigration enforcement or immigration issues. So we became highly interested in understanding these policies. And when I say we, I mean colleagues at Concordia University as well as at Ryerson University, so Megan Joy, John Shield, Graham Hudson, and Idil Achak. We have been developing this research program about sanctuary cities in Canada, where we actually ask two questions that are simple but quite important. So the first one is, what are cities actually doing in Canada when they declare themselves sanctuary cities? So that means looking at the policy design, the law, the policy, and other initiatives through document analysis as well as through interviews. And the second question we were interested in is, how do stakeholders evaluate the impact of these policies on the population they're expected to serve? So undocumented, and non-status precarious population. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we found about these two questions, and then ultimately tell us what we feel the answers to these questions actually tell us regarding thinking about why do cities sometimes implement inclusionary policies when there's no actual need to do so. Well, I feel there's actually a need, but when the usual drivers aren't present. So looking at what are these cities actually doing when they declare themselves sanctuary cities? So the first finding we have from our project is that generally Canadian cities will use the language of inclusion, will use the language of fear as well when declaring themselves sanctuary cities. So they will not use the language of sanctuary per se, and they won't even use the language of protection. They'll be really focused on the issue of access. So access to city services, access to the state in general. We then found, looking at policy instrument and actual city intervention, that generally Canadian cities, when they say they implement sanctuary policies, tend to focus on information-based instruments. So service scans, directive to city employees, as well as public awareness campaign explaining how you can access city services and whether you need or not to provide identification. So the picture I have on this slide is a website created by the City of Toronto, for example, where you can see whether you need to provide information about your immigration status to access specific services. What we also found looking at these policies at the national level is that they actually are rarely funded. So there's a pattern in which the local government will talk about implementing a policy, will make a declaration, might even have a vote at the local council, but will not allocate any money to actually fund it. So this has to be funded by municipal services using existing budgets. Similarly, you also have a clear problem or a clear issue where there's never an actual responsibility for implementation. So only in 2 cases, Montreal and Toronto, do you actually have an office is responsible for the implementation of this city. In other cases, the responsibility will be diffused across units, which means if some of you know how public administration function, that nobody ends up being responsible. And finally, a really important thing about Canadian policies is that they explicitly, in their text and in the declaration, tend to limit their application, and especially when it comes to the police. So most of these policies are explicitly telling us that the police and the local police will not be affected by these policies, which in most cases actually defeats the purpose. So we concluded in a publication forthcoming that it actually makes no sense to talk about sanctuary policy if you look at the content of these policies in Canada. actors might themselves use that language, but we think that in order to really describe what's happening on the ground, we probably should focus on the label of localist access policies. There are policies that focus on providing information about access to existing municipal services. There are policies that do not affect immigration enforcement through policing. And they also are policies that really rarely or actually never criticize national or international immigration policies. So there's a discourse of fear, but we never know why it's created. A second part of our project has been to ask, how do stakeholders evaluate the impact of these policies? And we focused on stakeholders because ethically it's quite difficult and problematic to try to survey non-status population and to ensure their safety and their comfort. So instead what we did is that we focus on immigration service agencies, non-profit or acteurs associatifs au service des immigrants. And we're lucky in Canada to have a national list of these, which provided us with a broader survey sample to know who to ask questions. So we've surveyed about 300 providers from every cities in Canada, which provide us with about a 48% response rates, which is quite high for these kind of studies. So what did we find? First off, interestingly, about half of our sample knew about Canadian sanctuary policies. But what is probably more important is that only 39% of the organizations that work in cities that actually have a declaration, so Montreal, Toronto, Ajax, London, and the like, only 39% of them consider their city to be an actual sanctuary city. And when asked why that is, they really focus on two things. So first off, they confirm what we saw in our policy study, which is no funding and lack of municipal resources to implement the policies. And the second is that they talk about the experience of their client being still asked about their immigration status by city officials and by immigration enforcement agent and the police on the ground. We also focused on whether they felt like there were some actual kind of outcome-related impact to their clients. And here the results are a little more positive. So we asked them about feeling of safety for their client, overall feeling of fear, trust in the system, as well as feeling of belonging in the city. And as you can see here on the, I think it's the right side, I'm not sure where I am, but on the right side we have whether they feel like their client and the people they serve actually saw their feelings or their experience with the city decrease after the implementation of these policies. And on the other side, it's increased a lot. So when the bar is darker, it's positive. And when the bar is lighter, it's negative. And you can see that when it comes to feelings of safety in the city, as well as overall feelings of fear, we do have some positive leaning, though it's not, universal. Same with increase of trust in city institutions and feelings of belonging in the city. And what emerged here, and I think that's important, just going back here, if you look at these graphs, is that the modal respondent talk about the experience of their client not having changed generally as a result of these policies. So it hasn't been more negative, but it clearly hasn't been entirely more positive. So it means that basically stakeholders are ambivalent. They talk about the limited implication of Canadian sanctuary policies. They point to the impact, some impact on the population they serve, but very limited. And there really are, and because we had a qualitative side to a survey, they really talk about their uncertainty about whether the local scale and the urban scale was the right government to and the right venue to address the issues faced by undocumented and non-status populations in Canada, which really points to the importance of considering structure. And we can get back to that in the question. So what, right? This is a keynote for Europeans. So maybe you're like, well, I don't really care about what's going on in Canadian cities. So I think that there are broader lessons that can be applied to other cases. So first, it's really to point to the reality that the local scale is a complex site for inclusion. So there's a lot of, I guess, positive literature out there about how cities could really change the game when it comes to immigration. And this literature is both normative as well as more theoretical and or policy oriented. And I think our findings point to the importance of that, right? And that the cities and urban actors are in an undeniable position to foster innovation, be it because they need to or be it because they have a different perspective. But we also demonstrate that jurisdictional capacity and policy capacity are really important when thinking about these innovations. And we'll get back to that in the next slide. But in Canada, the limited resources of municipal government and their limited jurisdictional capacity, especially when compared to US city, means that the diffusion of such concept as sanctuary city is obviously fraught. And I think a larger point here, which is obvious but still worth repeating, is that we as migration scholars are really concerned about gaps between discourse and policy, between the policy on paper and the implementation. And our project really shows that these gaps are as present at the local scales as they are at the national scale. And ultimately, to me and to my team, the Canadian case points to the importance of complexifying our discussions of the drivers of diffusion and adoption of local inclusive policies. And so I think it's not just about serving local immigrant populations or about having a left-leaning cities. Our cases actually point to two things that are worth also exploring. So one is the impact of political strategies by elected officials and clientelism, especially attempts by mayors and local actors at differentiating themselves from their predecessors or from their opponent. There is also potentially a dynamic of capturing the left as well as capturing immigrant or immigrant-leaning voters. But I think what is perhaps more interesting and points to some of the work being done by some members of Institut Convergence as well as some members of the Local Act project is the importance of marketing strategies in an attempt by cities to present themselves as inclusive space, but also as modern and, great, creative cities to go back to Richard, Florida. And so we can see that in several cities in Canada, the implementation of sanctuary cities had less to do with serving immigrant and more about actually making a diversity case to attract younger people, to attract more left-leaning residents. And I think that we need to think about that too, and to think about how these inclusive policy actually fit within neoliberal rethinking of the cities and of city governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireille. Thank you very much. I think there will be many convergences with our three next speakers.